unique position to speak to the topic of his dissertation and a book manuscript that he's developing right now on an artist called Képes. And the reason that I was particularly interested for our audience is because you know that we did the Moholy-Nagy show recently, and Képes was a student of Moholy's. And he's an artist who probably isn't as familiar to you or to most people, except for specialists of Bauhaus. But I think he's a really interesting test case, and because John has spent so much time in the archives at MIT and developed so much original material, he can really show us a lot of things that nobody else knows about, and that's always the best kind of lecture to receive. So like our other speakers, he'll enjoy 2 sessions with us, and then we're gonna conclude with Charlie Stuckey, that art world veteran. I'm sure he hates being called an art world veteran, but unfortunately that's what he is now. And he's going to be addressing the intriguing topic of accumulation in contemporary art. And that'll round out our season. So without further ado, I don't think I need to repeat too much about John, who received his PhD from Stanford. And, you know, he's really been the recipient of some of the greatest honors in our field, including a fellowship at CASVA. He got the 24-month Chester Dale Fellowship that I didn't get when I was his age. Which is a real honor. And he, you know, he's also done a show at the Cantor where he was also supported on Képes, in fact. So he's got some exhibition work under his belt too. And now he's on the job market and will hopefully be hearing good news soon and will be the professor he deserves to be very soon. So with that, help me welcome John to the stage.
Okay. So I'd like to start by just thanking Ike for the very generous introduction. And I also wanted to thank Michelle West for all of her help with the details and organizing my visit. So as Ike mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about an artist, a designer, he called himself a visual theorist, named György Kepes. And as Ike said, Képes is very little studied and he's been long forgotten. So part of my project is really about recovering the work of a figure who has remained somewhat obscure, but who actually is very relevant and timely in different ways, and I'll elaborate some of those. So, and this project started as my doctoral dissertation at Stanford. I'm now developing it into a book manuscript that will be published by MIT Press. So I think the first thing to do is just go into who Képes is. Képes is Hungarian-American. He was born in 1906 in a small town outside of Budapest named Selp in Hungary. And he was trained as a painter, but he became influenced by various strands of avant-garde modernism. So constructivism, cubism, surrealism, these big canonical movements entered into Hungary years after they had been pioneered in places like Moscow, in places like Paris. And he's inspired by these trends, and he actually leaves Hungary to go to Berlin in order to join the avant-garde. And he works with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, a figure who might be familiar to many of you from the show here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, but also the exhibition that traveled through Los Angeles recently. So Képes works for Moholy-Nagy, who had been a master at the Bauhaus, a teacher at the Bauhaus, the famed German art school. And Képes becomes Moholy's assistant for this period after Moholy has left the Bauhaus, and he works with Moholy on various design commissions and commercial design, advertising, for example. And Képes begins exploring different modernist trends. So he explores photography. And for example, here's one of his photographs. He, like Moholy, studied and created what are called photograms. So photographs created without the use of a camera. So objects are actually placed onto photographic paper, the paper is exposed to light, and it reveals various abstract forms through the impressions left on the photographic surface. This is something Moholy pioneered, and Kepes continues the tradition of exploring experiments with light through the photogram. But Képes, as you can imagine, it's the 1930s, and Nazism is on the rise. Képes is Hungarian by birth, and many of these figures in the European avant-garde are forced to leave Europe, and especially to flee Germany and Berlin. So Moholy first leaves to London, and then Képes follows him. Moholy then, after that, 1937, travels to the United States. Képes follows him again, and Moholy sets up a school, an art school, an attempt to recreate the Bauhaus in Chicago, called the New Bauhaus. It has various names: School of Design, Institute of Design, but it's an attempt to really recreate the famous German art school in the United States. And he hires Képes as one of his instructors, so Képes ends up in the United States in 1937. And eventually, he stays at the New Bauhaus for about 5 years. He has a few sort of short-term jobs, but finally ends up at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Képes spends most of his time in Cambridge at MIT from 1945 until 1974, and it's a very unusual context, as you can imagine, for an artist. He's the first artist hired by MIT, and MIT is dominated by science, by technology, and Képes is very out of place. So my project thinks about this sense of migration of the Bauhaus, the sort of exile of the Bauhaus, this diaspora, a figure from Europe who ends up in a very foreign context, not only a new country, but also a scientific context, a technical context, a context that's not typically examined or considered in terms of the visual arts. So he's a very displaced person, and that is really partly why he's been overlooked in art history and he's been forgotten, but also what makes him interesting and relevant is that he tried to forge different types of connections at MIT with scientists. And just to read a few, so I found in Kepes' papers just this very brief comment in some lecture notes that sort of sums up this sense of diaspora. He wrote, "I am vagabond, Budapest, Berlin, London, USA." So the sense of the full trajectory of the migration that is really characteristic of many artists in the 1930s faced with the threat of fascism. So his projects at MIT become somewhat more unusual. So he's doing these photographic experimentations in the 1930s and 40s. He also authors a book titled Language of Vision that examines ideas that are associated with the Bauhaus around visual design, around perception, around organizing visual elements, graphic design, for example. And when he gets to MIT, he takes this project and he tries to work more specifically with scientists and with technologies at MIT. So, for example, he authors another series of books in the 1960s which bring together writings from art historical figures, from artists, from designers, but also figures in the sciences. And these figures are all very surprising, I think, for an artist to be working with. And it's worth emphasizing just right off the bat that MIT in this moment is very much tied to the military-industrial complex. So scholars have referred to MIT as an archetypal example of the Cold War university. Its research is really devoted towards military applications. It's funded by the Defense Department. Even the scientific research that's happening, the experiments with computer technology, for example, all of that has applications in the military, and I think that becomes a problematic aspect of Kepes' career, that he has such a close proximity to military power. So to give you a sense of that, he works with, at MIT, he works with a metallurgist who is most famous for preparing the plutonium that was used in the first atomic bomb. He works with an engineer, an MIT engineer, who invented one of the first digital computers. The purpose of this computer was to organize a air defense system across the United States, specifically against Soviet attack in the 1950s. And then Kepes also works with a mathematician who invented ways to simulate and predict the effects of thermonuclear war, so the use of the hydrogen bomb. And some of these people are listed here among these volumes where he had writings from artists about various design or visual topics matched up with writings from these scientists who are really, on the vanguard, forefront of advanced research, but research that had all of these military applications. So in addition to these collaborative books, Kepes also studies scientific images produced by scientists at MIT, images that Kepes finds in MIT's laboratories, and he exhibits them. He also creates a book where he pairs them up with works of art, The New Landscape in Art and Science. And he also establishes a research center. It's called the Center for Advanced Visual Studies in mid-1960s at MIT. And the goal of this institution is to bring artists to MIT to work with scientists, to use new technologies, and to create various collaborative works of art, technologically based works of art. And in this role, through the center, he curates a number of exhibitions. One of them, for example, is called Exploration. It was originally intended to be the US representation of the Sao Paulo Biennial in 1969, but instead it is after a protest, which I will get into in my second talk. The exhibition instead opens at MIT and then at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So Kepes is involved in a lot of collaborative projects that are a little bit less typical. He's a painter and a photographer, but the core of his work is really these various collaborative endeavors, and that's what I want to emphasize. So, and to get in a little bit more deeply in terms of what I'm trying to do in my own interpretation of this figure, I want to just start by examining two portraits of the artist. So the first one is taken in 1930. It's a self-portrait. And it shows Kepes, he's peering over a mirror. So there's a mirror, here's the edge of the mirror, you can see, on the floor below him. And he has a camera on a tripod posed above him, and the camera is looking out a window. And he is actually here, he's holding, you can't see it, it's not reflected in the mirror, but he's holding a camera, and that's what he's taking this photograph with. And it's an interesting image in part because it's very, it evokes cubism, it evokes constructivism. It shows the artist thinking about reflections, perception. Of course, there's the mirror, there's also the window, there's the surface of the photographic print itself. So there's all these different reflecting surfaces, and he's putting himself into these various fractured perspectives. It's very canonical, I think, in terms of being cubistic or constructivist. And in fact, it's very similar to other portraits that constructivists or cubists make of their own, self-portraits that they make that depict them thinking about perception and representation and the fracturing of perspective, for example. So that image is from 1930. And then the second is a portrait, not a self-portrait, but a portrait taken by a photojournalist of Kepes at MIT in 1969. So in a way, it's similar. It shows Kepes with various technologies, photographic technologies, lamps, for example. There's the tripod, again, repeated. But it's also very different. So Kepes here is wearing a suit and tie. He's very formally composed. He's very stern looking, very serious. And I mean, it strikes me that he's now sort of embodying a more technocratic perspective, that he's conveying something of the institutional power at MIT. And in fact, these images were created by this photojournalist as a commission by MIT in order to promote MIT's agenda and mission through documents like promotional brochures and other institutional documents that would present the faculty. So in comparing these two images, I think it explains something of the gap, the transformation that happens in Kepes's career. That on the one hand, in the 1930s, he's this sort of revolutionary, modernist avant-garde figure, and that by the late 60s, he is totally ensconced in a very establishment position. And it seems, on the one hand, the technology continues, an interest in science continues, but he's also in a radically different position, and some of the revolutionary aspects in this photograph don't actually carry over here. And that's part of what I'm interested in. What happens to this avant-garde figure when he enters a very establishment context, one that is not typically examined or embraced in a study of modernism. So my project really focuses more on this version of Kepes and not this one. And so I just want to lay out the structure of my two talks today and also next week. And I'll look at a number of different projects that Kepes embarks on. So the first, part one, is on camouflage. I'll think a little bit more about what Kepes does during World War II as he arrives in the United States, specifically his military training in camouflage and how he attempts to apply principles of design that are associated with the Bauhaus to the camouflage and disguise of cities to protect them from aerial attack. And he actually was trained by the military. He receives certification and becomes a camouflage instructor. And it's a part of his history that he then later repressed, renounced. I mean, he didn't want to have this sort of identification with the military. But in fact, it was very concrete. And then second, I'll look more at scientific patterns, the patterns that Kepes studied and collected at MIT, and what he might have been trying to do with studying these unusual scientific images, things like cell patterns, bolts of electricity, for example. And then part 3 and 4 next week, we'll look at the activities at Kepes's center in the mid-1960s. So the various collaborations that he undertakes in trying to get artists who have visited MIT, working with scientists, and also some of the backlash that he faces in trying to create these interdisciplinary exchanges. And then finally, Kepes's experiments with creating works that speak to the environment and also to environmental catastrophe around, say, 1970, when there's new consciousness of environmental damage, pollution, for example, and how he attempts through his center to address these problems through works of art. So, number 1, camouflage. And to open up this topic, I want to just start by looking at an image. It is a diagram, we could say, that Kepes had created for a pamphlet that was produced by Collins, Miller, and Hutchings Incorporated, so an advertising and printing firm in Chicago. And they hired and commissioned graphic designers, artists, to create various portfolios to promote their services. So in this image, you can see here on the far right, there's various documents. Each one is a sheet of paper with various visual elements on it. And these are all associated with specific figures. So this document is very similar to a work by Kandinsky that studies points, sort of dots, and how they could be arranged on a page. This one evokes, for example, early compositions by Mondrian, where he's playing with different formal elements that are all very perpendicular to one another. There's references to other avant-garde figures, Malevich, for example, and then here finally on the bottom is a design that Képes actually creates for an advertisement. So he's creating this lineage that includes various figures associated with the Bauhaus, the famous German art school, Kandinsky, Malevich, Mondrian, and then he's putting his own work at the bottom. So the sort of lineage that he's constructing is very obvious, I think. He's placing himself as a sort of a follower of the Bauhaus, even though he's now at this moment in the United States, not in Germany. He's at the new Bauhaus. But what's interesting is that he's actually not emphasizing these documents. He's really emphasizing perception, how we see these elements. So he shows that by having this word illustration, which is then reflected and refracted through the eyeball onto the surface of the retina. And he's also emphasizing this further by using the typographic symbols of the hand, the pointing hand, the manacle, pointing to the act of perception. So he's already shifting in a direction that's notable and significant away from creating works of art and instead in thinking about vision, how we see, and how modern art might help us see in a particular way. But what's also interesting about this document, first of all, that it shows his emphasis on perception as opposed to the creation of works of art, but also the date. He created it in 1941, and of course, World War II has already begun, and the document effectively is disguising some of Kepes's other activities, which are more militaristic. So, to give you a sense of a few photographs, one of the unusual applications for Kepes's interest in perception is in aerial vision. When you're looking at the Earth from the sky, the landscape becomes extremely abstracted, obviously. We've all experienced this looking out of an airplane. And when you're looking at the ground, you see points and lines and shapes and shadows that are very evocative of modern art. So Kepes becomes enthralled by this. He's fascinated by the image of the Earth as seen from an airplane and how it's all, it's sort of a, modern art has suddenly been projected into the landscape. The landscape itself seems to be evoking abstract works of art. And Kepes he first flew an airplane in Europe in the 1930s, but he flies again in the United States, specifically when he is commissioned by the mayor of Chicago to study the protection of Chicago against aerial attack. And this obsession with defending cities against aerial attack obviously comes to the fore after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So after that moment, many cities begin studying how they could disguise various features of their landscape from identification in the air so that they could be protected, so that they will not be bombed. So Kepes, again, he's flying through the mayor's study group to identify defense of the city, and he becomes really fascinated with this type of vision. And in fact, aerial vision would persist as one of his main preoccupations. So this is actually a much later work. It's from 1959, but it makes sense to talk about this now. It is a mural that Kepes produces using various lighting elements and electronic technology. So it uses neon lights, it uses various pinpoint lights, and these lights would flicker and flash in different ways. Here's a view of it. This is Kepes's photograph. Of course, you can't tell what it is. And then this is an installation view. And he created this mural for KLM Airlines, for the ticket office for KLM on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. And the idea was to recreate the vision that you would experience from an airplane looking down through this mural. So it's also programmed with electronic technology, and the lights flash at different rates. The neon ribbons illuminate and then go dark, and it's intended to recreate the lights from streets, the street grid, the lights that you would see, the headlights on a highway, for example, and evoke the experience of being in the air. Obviously, KLM wants to emphasize that fascination with aerial vision, so that's why they commissioned him to make this mural. But Kepes's initial interest is really rooted in the moment of World War II. So I have a statement that I want to read from Kepes describing this work, which I think gets to some of his fascination with aerial experience. And this is a statement that is then in various press materials that KLM releases on the completion of the work. And Kepes writes, "Flying above a big metropolis in the night offers a visual experience incomparable to anything man experienced before. For no matter how chaotic, blighted, or illegible a large city is, it is transformed when the evening comes and the lights go on. Points, lines, planes, figures, and volumes of light," so in other words, the visual elements that he was studying that derived through various Bauhaus studies, points, lines, planes, figures, and volumes of light, steady and winking, moving and still, white and colored, from windows, signs, headlights, traffic lights, street lights, combine into a fluid, luminous wonder, one of the great sights of this or any age. The impressive sight, with its accidental visual wealth, could only be compared with the concentrated, ordered beauty of the great windows of the 13th century cathedrals. So he has a very, he has a sort of sublime relationship with this experience of aerial vision. And he's also, evoking the cathedral is, I think, really significant. Kepes would, in fact, also design stained glass windows for churches in the 50s and 60s. So he's very much interested in trying to create this sort of heavenly light as he would experience it from the sky. But going back to World War II, so Kepes's experience of this type of vision is mediated by a number of different technologies. First of all, the plane itself, obviously, is a new technology. The windows through which you can see are also a new technology. They use an acrylic material that is synthesized for applications, plexiglass, for example, in military aircraft. He's also looking through a device called a bomb sight. The bomb sight is used to target bombs so that they hit the specific target. And the issue in aerial attack is that the bombs have to be released because the plane is moving in advance of the target. So you need to identify that target and drop the bomb before you're over it. And it requires a sighting telescope that can be stabilized to the ground even if the plane is moving up in the air. So this device is invented. It's called the Norden bomb sight, and it's stabilized to the ground through various gyroscopes and has telescopes that you can look through and identify things on the surface. Of course, it's also creating a type of vision that's evocative of looking through a camera. It's mediating vision through a technology that changes what we see in different ways. It erases some of the specificity of the targets on the ground, the fact that they're real people, real places, for example, but it also abstracts them. It makes them even more, even more like works of modern art, in the sense that what you see becomes points, lines, volumes, shapes, shadows, for example. So Kepes is also experimenting with seeing through the bomb sight as he's hired by the mayor of Chicago to study the city and how it could be protected. And he begins thinking up ways of disguising targets from this type of technological vision. And this is a headline from a newspaper, the Chicago Herald-American, and it says on the top how Chicago may hide from bombers, and it shows aircraft advancing, and here is Képes working with one of his students on a model, and the newspaper has a series of photographs that are sort of interesting. This shows the Merchandise Mart, which at the time was the largest building in the world. It would soon be surpassed by the Pentagon. And the claim in these series of photographs is that by putting, what do they say here? Oh, it doesn't, let me see, I think I have a quote. The claim is that an artist could use paint, dabs of paint, I think is referenced somewhere in the text, although I'm not seeing it from here, to hide this enormous structure. So it's a little bit of a sensationalistic and ridiculous claim, but in fact, that was what the new Bauhaus would attempt to do, to hide huge structures by creating various visual decoys, by inflating structures on the rooftop, by using visual elements that would supposedly distract enemies who were approaching in airplanes. And I'm just going to read a little passage from this news article. Learning how to conceal Chicago's ruse from possible attack by enemy bombers, 100 art students are perfecting the art of camouflage by experimenting daily with light, shadows, and color mixing. Their training is conducted at the School of Design, also known as the New Bauhaus, in Chicago, 247 East Ontario Street, by György Kepes. So Képes is in charge of these camouflage classes that would attempt to disguise these structures. And this gives you a sense of the goal. This is a photograph of a Boeing plant outside of Seattle. And you can see, this is the factory itself. You can see that it's actually covered with a false street grid. So there's a simulacrum of small town America, suburbia, plastered on the rooftop. It's painted. There's also actual, it's like a stage set. There's actual, fake trees and fake storefronts and houses. And when seen in an aerial photograph, this massive factory suddenly now appears to be a street grid. And the idea is that then, when viewed through the bomb site, when an enemy is approaching, when they're trying to find that target, they will be fooled because they can't find a structure that's large enough to manufacture airplanes, and the bombs will not fall on these high-value targets. This field, industrial camouflage, it gets this name, industrial camouflage, actually becomes a topic of study across the US. It's sort of surprising. For example, this is a manual, an industrial camouflage manual. It's produced by the Pratt Art School in Brooklyn. So art schools are focusing on the topic of camouflage, in part because they are trying to find ways to stay relevant during the war. And one of the ways, producing graphic art posters, for example, is one application of the arts, but another would be to actually disguise cities through the expertise of artists. It's also, at the same time, a topic of interest to the military, and they produce their own version of these industrial camouflage manuals. So this is Modern Camouflage, the New Science of Protective Concealment, and it's authored by a major in the Corps of Engineers in the military. So we have this intersection between science and between art, something that Képes was preoccupied with throughout his career, but also the context of the military, which is actually bringing them together, which is also the reality later in Képes's career at MIT. So you're getting a sense, I hope, of some of the entanglement of Képes's projects, that his artistic expertise did not necessarily involve the creation of works of art per se, as conventionally known, but instead found these unusual contexts where he was valued for his artistic knowledge and where it could be applied to unusual, timely problems like camouflage. And Képes's course, so this is a pamphlet, a course announcement from the School of Design, the New Bauhaus, and it shows the course that Képes then taught at this art school, Principles of Camouflage. And it also lists a number of different figures from a wide range of different fields. So this topic becomes very interdisciplinary. It involves expertise from people who are not necessarily typically considered in the arts. And suddenly their expertise with optics, for example, or there's the Riggs Optical Company, a medical doctor. So a wide range of expertise could become useful for studying camouflage. And I have a few diagrams here from a notebook from a student who was in Kepes's Principles of Camouflage class. And they help illustrate how Bauhaus ideas about organizing a picture plane, organizing visual elements, are actually being reinterpreted as a way to think about disguising cities. So the first is just a study of perspective. The aerial observer sees from above, must recognize the target from the oblique angle. So already the study of perspective could be used in terms of thinking through vision from the sky. And then a number of diagrams also indicate how structures could be disguised. So a building, for example, surrounded by trees could be patterned. A pattern could be painted on the surface, which helps it blend into its surroundings. Shadows, another thing that was studied extensively. The shadow of a building makes it identifiable from the air. So finding ways to create different shadows through projections that were built onto a structure could help disguise it. This shows study again of light and how light is reflected from different surfaces, how the outlines of a building could be changed by creating projections that would evoke the outlines of trees, for example. How light reflects against different surfaces, so grass does not reflect, and then a metallic surface would reflect light. And then optical illusions, another area where thinking through the design of visual elements on a page might actually be useful for thinking through design from the air or seeing from the air. So not only is Kepes teaching camouflage at the New Bauhaus, as I mentioned, he's also trained by the military. And he is sent to a military installation outside of Washington, D.C. called Fort Belvoir. And this is where engineers were trained for service. And this photograph shows what was known as the camouflage laboratory at Fort Belvoir. And it has various military personnel studying maps and aerial vision, as you can see. And Kepes studies at this fort as part of a program to train artists, a very unusual program. And he appears, for example, in this photograph, hard for me to see, right there. And he is sent to the school along with a wide range of architects, designers, artists, landscape architects, figures who are teaching at schools across the United States, who are teaching at art schools or in art departments at other universities. And he is sent to Fort Belvoir for a 2-week program where he learns the military's approach to camouflage. And the goal of this program, it's run by a unit called the Office of Civilian Defense. And the goal was to train artists who would then return to their home institutions where they would train their own students, thus providing a wide range of personnel experienced in camouflage and at the ready should the U.S. come under attack again, a second sort of Pearl Harbor, for example. So it was seen as a defensive program. It emerges because of Pearl Harbor, and after 1942, when the direction of the war shifts and when the threat seems less relevant, it is abandoned and forgotten because it's actually not necessary or applicable. I mean, we did not have to disguise Chicago from enemy attack. It was not attacked. So you can see the range of this program. It's actually pretty extraordinary. It included art schools across the country, but also, I mean, the best universities and colleges were also training people at Belvoir in order to teach camouflage. So, range of Ivy League schools in the Northeast, universities across the country are all emphasizing camouflage. And Kepes receives a certificate from Fort Belvoir that it states his name, György Kepes, and then also School of Design Chicago. And the idea was that he was, officially sanctioned to be teaching military improved courses at the new Bauhaus. Getting ahead of myself. So, let's see. So one thing that's interesting about camouflage, so I've sort of examined the practical application, the sort of literal camouflage of the city that Kepes embarks on once he arrives in the United States. And that involved his training at Fort Belvoir, the courses he offered at the new Bauhaus, his study of aerial vision, his obsession with seeing from the sky and how land targets could be disguised. But there's also another dimension of camouflage that I want to emphasize. And it's the idea that Kepes was not only interested in disguising targets on the ground, but also in disguising himself, that there's a sort of more metaphorical camouflage at play, and that in working with the military, in working with scientists from a wide range of fields, in taking on these applications of the Bauhaus, he's actually disguising some of his own background at the time. Kepes, for example, was a communist when he was in Berlin in the 1930s. He created communist propaganda, as did many modern artists. For example, this is a cover for a magazine, Das Neue Russland, The New Russia, which attempted to promote Soviet communism in Germany. And it provided this sort of idealistic utopian vision of communist society. And for example, here is a soldier holding a rifle on this cover that Kepes designs. And I think, does his name appear? I'm not sure if it does on this one. So on some of them, Kepes' name appears, and of course, instead of being György Kepes, he is Georg Kepes, using his sort of German name. So his name shifts in every context. Now, I like to compare this, to another image that also shows a soldier, and this is from a pamphlet that the military distributed at Fort Belvoir about camouflage. And one page says, "You are the target," and it shows a target aimed at a soldier holding a firearm of some sort. So I think it makes a helpful juxtaposition, this idea that individuals are also being targeted, and that Kepes, as a former communist during World War II in the United States, also felt threatened. So some of the camouflage is about self-disguise, about hiding one's own past, and about shielding one's identity so that others don't know. He is a foreigner, he's in exile, he was a radical, and now he is operating through these connections with the military. So it required another form of camouflage, a more metaphorical version of camouflage. And just to sort of conclude or wrap up this discussion of camouflage, these relationships in terms of the interdisciplinary nature, the applications of modern art to unusual projects and problems, and also this idea of disguising oneself. These become crucial for Kepes' entire career. He's always, I think at MIT, he's always worried about people discovering in the age of McCarthyism that he had this communist background. He's also embarked on the same sort of collaborative projects that are entangled with military power. So this moment, World War II, really, he represses the fact that he was involved in camouflage in his own biography, but in fact, those relationships are really key to everything he does afterwards to sort of set the stage for similar projects. And with that, I want to get into my next topic, which is moving just after World War II. Kepes arrives at MIT, and his main artistic project that he embarks on after he arrives in 1945 at MIT. And we'll repeat some of these themes around camouflage. We'll repeat as we discuss his study of pattern. So Kepes arrives at MIT in 1945, and he's faced with trying to make himself relevant again in a very unusual context. And he does so in part by studying images produced by scientists as opposed to creating works of art. He's finding images, photographs that these scientists have collected in their own research as part of their study of various phenomena. So Kepes creates this exhibition. It's titled The New Landscape. It opens in 1951 at MIT, and it includes these photographs that he's found on photographic panels. The panels are two-sided. They're very cheaply made. They're disposable, but they're two-sided, and they hang from a lattice structure, a sort of metal lattice. And the idea was that the viewer would be surrounded by these scientific images. So it's very consistent with other exhibitions from the 1950s, exhibitions in the UK, for example, that surrounded viewers with images, with photographs, or even exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, a very famous exhibition, The Family of Man, which again used photographs that were suspended in different ways to create this sense of immersion in a photographic world or landscape. But Kepes' exhibition was a little bit more unusual because he is using these scientific patterns. And these images really, he collected anything he could find. So some of them, let's see, this one, for example, shows muscle fiber seen under a microscope, 2,000 times magnification. Another one shows various chemical compounds. It's called a eutectic, so a solution of different chemical compounds. And then also cells, for example, tissue cells that are magnified. And in collecting these images, he's taking things that are microscopic, and he's also taking macro perspective. So he's mixing this perceptual experience of looking closely at something, but also being very far away, and confusing issues of scale and size through the photographic image, which has a tendency to make everything seem equatable and equal, even though the scales are radically different. And one of the most interesting to me is an image called a Lichtenberg figure. And this one is created by an MIT physicist, Arthur R. von Hippel, and it's actually a bolt of electricity on a photographic plate that then creates this pattern. So, and this shows you some of the earliest Lichtenberg figures created in the 18th century that inspired Arthur R. von Hippel. And his own version, again, recreates these sort of early scientific experiments in studies of electricity. So I think the real question is, what is the point of this project? What is Kepes doing? Why is he collecting these scientific patterns? What is he trying to offer MIT by studying these images as if they were works of art? Because remember, they're not works of art. They're just objective records created for scientific study. So let's see. Again, here's another Lichtenberg figure. Kepes is interested, I'm getting ahead of myself, but maybe it's worth elaborating a little bit just what these objects are. So these show the panels themselves. There's an index card for comparison, and you can see they're two-sided. So there's another image here in the back, and they have these eye hooks, and that's how they're suspended. And you can also tell that they're falling apart. They're in poor condition. They weren't intended as works of art that would last, really. And so now they're sort of decaying in the archive. Now, in addition to this exhibition and this study of photographic images, Kepes also compares them with works of art. So he also produces a book, a catalog of sorts, which is titled The New Landscape in Art and Science. And he tries to mix these images together. And the idea is that he's pairing works of art with works of science. So he's uniting what has become known as the two cultures, art and science, as a sort of imposed entities or philosophical worldviews that are being brought together. And he does that even on the cover of this book by showing a rose, symbol of beauty, with dots from computer punch tape. So a very sort of 1950s image of science, what would be a predecessor to the punch cards used in the 60s and 70s. And then he's also, this is the cover without the dust jacket. He uses this image, it's from an oscilloscope screen, but it shows two threads that are being spiraled together. And again, it's a metaphor for art and science being united and relating to one another. And then inside the book, he makes a number of unusual comparisons. So he's using the format of the book in the sense that there's a gutter that divides two pages to compare and contrast different images. And it's very much like a traditional art historical slide comparison, where you're given two things and you have to figure out how they relate. So we have, for example, a snowflake on one side and then a stem from a plant seen under a microscope on another. And he is relating the organic with the inorganic. He's also inverting things like the black and the white. So he's creating these relationships. And the relationships also repeat among individual panels that he is exhibiting. So again, we have this sort of burst-like visual form. It's also very reminiscent of the iris of an eyeball, which would be very relevant to Képes. And again, it's relating the organic and the inorganic. So there's a lot of these juxtapositions that he's preoccupied with, and he wants us to discover them, to try to find them in his strange and evocative collection of images. These oppositions preoccupy him, and he actually extensively studies this idea that the world, the universe, is composed of opposites that are united. And he would create throughout his archive, there are many examples of this from the 1940s through the 1970s, where he's creating these lists. He called them balance sheets of various opposites. So I'm just going to read a few of these. Familiar, hackneyed versus unfamiliar, new, fresh. Abstract, concrete. Organized, chaotic. Stabilized, fluid. Named, unnamed. Meaningful, meaningless. So he's thinking about all of these oppositions and keeping them in some sort of suspension. Here he's doing it very theoretically, abstractly, but his images also repeat those oppositions. For example, this spread from his book shows a sample from a leaf seen under a microscope that is compared to a photograph by Edward Weston of the surface of a desert, so the ground itself. And what Képes does is he actually positions this leaf sample so that the pattern is continuous across the page. And the idea is that he's relating life in terms of, an organic quality with something that's mineral, that's something that's inorganic. So he's creating this union, the same types of oppositions on this page. He's doing it here visually. We have one on one side and another on the other, and there's a continuity across. Now, some of his pages and some of his comparisons are much more bizarre and not specific. So here we have, for example, the bud of a flower from a tree, I think, a carved Aztec sculpture, a Chinese jade, and then a sculpture by Brancusi. So he's creating these relationships that are nonsensical. I mean, they're not real. They're invented, they're imaginative. But part of the provocation is to force us to come up with why these things are so similar and to force us to think about the visual continuity across things that are different. And, getting ahead of myself. I think what Kepes is aiming to do is really create an enchantment, I would say, with visual experience. He's taking these images, many of them are from scientists who use them purely in objective ways to study how cells function, for example. But Kepes takes them, he removes them from that context, and he's trying to animate them and give them life in a new way and create a sense of wonder and enchantment with visual study, with visual experience. Why is he doing that? In part because he's at MIT and he perceives that the Institute is lacking in that sort of humanistic sensibility, that it's blind to the world even though advanced research is happening. So he's trying to offer some of that enchantment, some of that visual fascination as part of a humanistic program that would balance or correct the emphasis on technical, logical, rational study and discourse. He's providing this counter discourse, I would say. And his notes explain a little bit. So this is just a little selection from one page where he puts this into words. He says, assumption A, creativity is value. B, creativity can be educated. So this whole program becomes part of his pedagogical mission or initiative at MIT. He calls it visual design. He also uses terms like education of vision, education of the eye. The idea is that he's teaching people to see. So again, it's like that diagram with which I opened discussion of camouflage, where he's showing visual elements, but we're not thinking so much about creating those visual designs. We're thinking about perception. We're thinking about seeing. We're thinking about how we look at the world, not how we create works of art. So he's trying to offer that as an artist at MIT as a way to balance the Institute as a whole. And other people have actually interpreted Kepes in very different ways, and it's worth mentioning. The common assumption among much of the literature is that Kepes is very reactionary. That's a word that comes up repeatedly. And I want to just read a brief description, for example, from an architectural historian. Well, let me see where it is. Well, I'm not exactly sure. I'm now so far off my notes, I'm not sure where it is. But this architectural historian describes Kepes as being complicit with MIT, as being a tool of the institution, as being reactionary because he's glorifying images of science, images of technology, as opposed to critiquing them in any way. So he's serving the Institute by glorifying its research, making it aesthetically valuable, imbuing it with beauty, for example, as opposed to taking any critical perspective on what that research really represents. So I'm sort of pivoting my argument and my interpretation of Kepes by nuancing and making that interpretation more complicated by suggesting that, in fact, Kepes is trying to re-enchant vision and to create this imaginative visual experience as a way to respond to the presence of military power at MIT. So I hope that makes some sense. I'm trying to see a more nuanced view as opposed to saying he's at MIT, therefore, it's the 1950s, everyone's working on military projects, he is complicit, end of story. I'm trying to make that a more complicated transactional relationship, which I think is more accurate to what it was historically. So, moving back to the exhibition, just to give you a sense of how this enchantment would work, here is another panel that he hung in his exhibition, and when you first see it, it looks like the surface of the moon, but the label actually identifies it as a camel's tongue, under 10 times magnification. So this, I think, gets to Kepes' idea of micro and macro and extending vision in all directions at the same time and creating a evocative, complicated interplay between what we see, the visual, and then the verbal, the textual modifier, which creates these associations which are not necessarily what you would have initially seeing this very sort of eerie moonscape-like image. And other comparisons are similar in creating relationships that don't exist, that are made up and invented, but which force us to think about what connects these things. So here, for example, is a piece of Sumerian stone and pearl work, so a sort of detailed mosaic-like pattern, a tapestry from a Nazca tapestry from Peru, a Byzantine mosaic, and then a painting by Mondrian. These things are not related. This is very bad art history, but it forces us to think about what connects things. So one way to connect them might be Old World, Sumeria, New World, Peru, ancient, or not exactly ancient, but not modern, versus modern. So it's forcing us to think about how we can relate things. And this process, I think, it reminds me of very ritual ways of understanding images. So divination, for example, studying entrails, study augury, thinking about patterns of birds in the sky. There's a mystical or mythological aspect to this type of visual study. And it makes a lot of sense. In fact, there are images of those objects in Kepes's book. So here is a rat's duodenum, so a section of the small intestine. So the idea of reading entrails is like literally evoked in the book with images of entrails. And of course, images of stars, so counting stars, again, another mystical process. Reading tea leaves. There are also many examples of leaf samples, so again, trying to read in something in these scientific images. And the other thing to mention is that von Hippel, who creates these Lichtenberg figures, also thinks about vision in this way. He's also captivated by a mystical or mythological way of seeing. And one thing that's surprising is that von Hippel actually first studied to be an art historian, and he studied under Heinrich Wöfflin, so one of the founders of art history as a discipline in the 19th century, early 20th century, and he studied under Wöfflin, and he was taken by the way that Wöfflin's lectures made works of art come alive, and this idea of vision being so important. But then von Hippel actually changed careers. He moved from art history to science after he received a letter from his father that said, "Study science or starve." And I think that gets to some of the tension, actually, that exists between trying to reconcile art and science, that this humanistic pursuit is suspect in some ways as being not valid, not legitimate. I'm just going to move ahead a little bit. And I want to elaborate this tension, because understanding the tension is really key to understanding Kepes's intervention. And this is a quotation that appears in Kepes's book in an essay. So in the New Landscape book that I've been examining, there are also texts by different figures, including a text by Walter Gropius, who is founder of the Bauhaus. He's also in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's teaching at Harvard, so he's also part of this diaspora and exile of the Bauhaus to the United States. And in this text, he writes, "In today's universities, we keep large departments under the name Arts and Sciences. But when we scrutinize their activities, we find that science has everything. This is the century of science. The artist is the forgotten man, almost ridiculed and thought of as a superfluous luxury member of society. Art is considered to be something which was accomplished centuries ago and is now being stored up in our museums, from which we may tap as much as is needed. As science is supposed to have all the answers for our predominantly materialistic period, art is doomed to languish. Which so-called civilized nation today honestly promotes creative art as a substantial part of life? This disintegrating society needs participation in the arts as an essential counterpart to science and its atomistic effect on us." So what's important here is that Gropius is framing the relationship between art and science as very antagonistic, as problematic and fraught. And that is not how Kepes presents it in the book. He speaks in positive terms. He's always optimistic. But I think that this sentiment reflected here is actually more accurate and sets the stakes for Kepes' intervention in relief, that there's a sort of tension between fields that he's trying to navigate. The other thing is that this quotation resonates today. It seems like Gropius could be talking about universities in the present as much as he's talking about universities circa 1950. And it reminds me in particular of Stanford University, which is where I began this project, and where there's also a sense of the sort of dominance of science and technology of Silicon Valley over the university and over its humanistic pursuits, its artistic pursuits. And that produces a tension and a question of what art can offer, how it can respond. This also matches Kepes' own experience. And I have another brief quote to read where he describes arriving at MIT. So this idea of being alienated or being, facing this sort of tension is something that he personally experiences. This is what he says, commenting on arriving in 1945. I was practically shocked. MIT was the arsenal of the world. It had a tremendous competency in producing intelligent weapons. It was without heart. Arriving at MIT and facing the long MIT corridors, I was as scared as you can imagine a young painter to be, end quote. So that gets to some of the tension that's there, even if Kepes does not convey it in his own study of scientific images. It's sort of a repressed tension. Well, just to really briefly, to sort of emphasize why this tension is relevant, I have a graph here that shows bachelor's degrees awarded in humanities subjects. So English, history, languages other than English, other humanities. So presumably art history is like somewhere below, below the purple line down here. And it shows a high point in the 1960s, a very steep decline, some rebounding in the 1990s, and then a continued decline. And so this is bachelor's degrees awarded as a percentage of all degrees. And it gives you a sense of the tension between art and science as something that is now being experienced. It continues to be a problem. If it's something that Kepes felt in 1950s, that was before this boom happened in humanistic fields in the 60s. So that tension is even more acute today. And this tension, as I mentioned, it's repressed in the book, but it is still present in the book. And he opens the very first page of The New Landscape in Art and Science with a quotation where he evokes this painting by de Chirico called The Mystery and Melancholy of the Street. He doesn't actually show the painting, but he evokes it. And he writes, a child rolls her hoop in a vast, lonely, nightmare landscape, the new landscape. This now familiar image in modern art distills for the spectator the pervasive emotional disaster of the 20th century, end quote. So the other thing to note is that this image also shows this long, very ominous street scene, corridor, and the idea of a frightening corridor is actually central to MIT. MIT is famous for the infinite corridor, a long hallway in the institute along which all of the scientific laboratories are aligned. And you can look through windows into these laboratories where scientists, engineers are building weapons, as the case may be. So Kepes is creating a sort of allusion to the experience of being in the infinite corridor at MIT and the sense of alienation that he experienced. Let's see. So I want to sort of leave some time for Q&A, so I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit and we can explore some of the tensions Kepes faced because of this project a little bit next week, and they'll be related to some of the topics next week. So, I think I'll just briefly sort of sum up with showing a little bit of the complexity of Kepes' visual design or education of vision project. And he becomes very associated with this pedagogical project, visual design. The courses that he's teaching are all in visual design. It's not even a field that existed before Kepes. So he invents this way of studying scientific images as if they are aesthetic documents. And he becomes so associated with vision itself that, for example, Alexander Calder would send Kepes a postcard that just uses this eyeball as a sort of pictographic emblem that embodies Kepes's project. And let's see, let's just move ahead a little bit. Okay, so in his notes, he explains the goal of visual design. And it relates to this tension that I've been describing between the arts and sciences. And he writes, I'm just going to jump around a bit, but I'm going to read from this note in his archives. Form thinking, structural thinking, configuration thinking is different from the simple making of little paintings in an art department of the university. Form thinking must penetrate all disciplines of education. How to do it? And then a bit further down, by making form thinking an educational subject in itself. Faculty and a department that specializes in it, that pools concrete materials, images, for example, from other departments, biology, physiology, psychology, art, painting, architecture, music, etc. So that gives you a sense. He's trying to unite all of these different disciplines through visual study. And he would also study in his own independent research a huge range of different fields. And these are his bibliographies for his research into what he's calling visual design. And they show some really unusual things. So let's see, Panofsky. So there's some iconic and very famous art historians listed. I'm not sure if Heinrich Wöfflin is here or not, but the art historian I mentioned as training physicist Arthur R. von Hippel, he's somewhere there. Kepes is reading him. He's also reading things like Hermann Rorschach, inventor of the Rorschach inkblot test, which is very relevant for how we might look at and think about interpreting these scientific patterns. He's also studying scholarship about Renaissance art, about ancient art, classical art, about modern art. It's sort of all time periods, all fields, all of it together, anything about vision. And he's trying to find ways to relate all of these fields. So maybe this is a good place just to pause for now. We'll continue next week. He faces a backlash for this project, and that's what I want to get into more and elaborate next week. And there's a sense of the tension in Gropius's quote, but he would also receive angry reviews about his book from a range of different critics. And in particular, I want to focus next week on a letter that Kepes receives from Sybil Moholy-Nagy, the widow of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And this letter attacks Kepes for being, as I've mentioned, complicit with MIT and claims that his visual design program in using images from the sciences, in involving collaborations with scientists, is not critical about the applications of MIT's research in the context of the early Cold War, and especially the Vietnam War. So he faces this backlash as if he's capitulated to the other side instead of resisting them. And I'll just sort of mention that now, and we'll talk more about that next week. It becomes a sort of problem of how you separate Kepes from this entanglement that he finds himself in. And it began with Camouflage, with his work during World War II, but it persists and it becomes especially acute in the era of the Vietnam War, when there's such a strong anti-war sentiment that erupts in the mid-1960s. And Kepes also opposes the Vietnam War and finds himself on the wrong side. And I think that's maybe suggested by that comparison of photographs that I started with. So we'll talk more about that next week, and I'm happy to take any questions or elaborate anything further. If you have any comments or remarks, I'd be very interested in hearing them. Yes?
For me, it's really interesting as you're talking, you're showing different objects and you're saying, how do these relate? They have no relation because they're, and all I can see are the patterns, and to me they are completely related because I could see the patterns and and I remember, you know, in the 50s and the early 60s, they were starting to teach about looking at things carefully,
Yes.
observation, and
Right.
seeing patterns in nature.
Yes,
And-
and that's something, I mean, Képes is so, like, that's his program. It's about
Right.
looking closely, seeing patterns, making connections, finding relationships between things. The critique is that those relationships are not real, that he's inventing relationships that don't exist.
It
And
was
in,
so good. And there's another little thing. It was in '69, I went to Africa with Peace Corps. And I was so excited because in England they had open education. And MIT started working with about 6 or 8 African countries and helping them to design their own science curriculum.
Okay.
And they were making booklets. And so I thought, wow, MIT, that's really interesting that they're doing open education.
right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, to my knowledge, Képes isn't involved in anything like that in the 60s, although he does have a student. So he's teaching, he's housed in the School of Architecture and Planning, and he's teaching, it's a general education course in visual design, so engineers might take his course and learn about looking and seeing, but architects would also take it. And there was one of his students was an architect who after his study at MIT, he moved to Africa, to South Africa. I think he was from South Africa, and promoted this sort of Bauhaus thinking in Africa. So there is a sort of, like a secondary diaspora that happens from all of these Bauhaus figures that have arrived in the US and are teaching at various schools. They have their own students who then travel further. So there's connections to be made between the Bauhaus and then this like wider diaspora in Latin America, Africa, Asia, for example. Yeah.
I see lots of connections. And I actually grew up in Chicago, so
Oh, yeah.
I was familiar with the Bauhaus.
Yes, great. Terrific.
Anybody else have any questions they'd like to pose? No? Well, we'll look forward to part 2 then of your talk. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Great depressing graph you showed there. That's what we wanted.
Yeah, sorry.